the world holds its breath as tensions in East Asia escalate. One of the most dangerous flashpoints in modern geopolitics lies across a narrow stretch of sea, the Taiwan Strait. For decades, China has maintained that Taiwan is a breakaway province destined for reunification, by force if necessary. At the same time, Taiwan continues to assert its sovereignty, while its alliances with the United States and other democratic nations grow stronger. But what would happen if diplomacy fails and China launches a full-scale military attack on Taiwan? The consequences would be historic, catastrophic, and deeply transformative. Not just for Asia, but for the entire global order. To understand the stakes, we need to begin with Taiwan's importance. Taiwan is not just an island of 23 million people. It is a technological superpower, producing more than 60% of the world's semiconductors and nearly 90% of the most advanced chips used in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Its location just off the coast of China and near key maritime shipping lanes makes it a strategic prize in any geopolitical context. Control of Taiwan would dramatically shift the balance of power in the Pacific, giving China unimpeded access to the Western Pacific and significantly weakening the U.S. alliance system in the region. China has never renounced the use of force to take Taiwan. President Xi Jinping has repeatedly called for reunification, warning that the question of Taiwan cannot be passed down to future generations. At the same time, Taiwan has steadily strengthened its democratic institutions and distanced itself from Beijing, especially under current leadership. The U.S., while maintaining a policy of strategic ambiguity, has increased its arms sales to Taiwan and deepened unofficial ties. In this powder keg of diplomacy, deterrence, and nationalism, one misstep could ignite a war with global consequences. So what if that day arrives? What if China finally decides to act and launches a coordinated military attack to take control of Taiwan? The opening salvo would likely be swift and overwhelming. China would likely use its vast missile arsenal to target Taiwan's key military infrastructure, airfields, naval bases, radar stations, and communication hubs. Simultaneously, cyber attacks would attempt to paralyze Taiwan's government and critical infrastructure, cutting off electricity, disabling banking systems, and sowing chaos among the population. An amphibious invasion might follow, though it would be one of the most complex and risky military operations since World War II. Taiwan's rugged coastline, strong military defenses, and mountainous terrain present enormous logistical challenges for any invader. Still, China could deploy hundreds of thousands of troops, accompanied by drones, helicopters, and aircraft, to establish a beachhead and push inland. It would be brutal, high-stakes combat, with heavy casualties on both sides. Taiwan, though vastly outnumbered, would not surrender easily. Its military has trained for decades for this scenario, and its people are deeply committed to defending their freedom. Street-to-street fighting in cities like Taipei and Kaohsiung could drag the war into a prolonged conflict, making a quick Chinese victory unlikely. Guerrilla resistance, sabotage, and insurgency could continue long after any occupation. The will of the Taiwanese people should not be underestimated. At this point, the world would be forced to make rapid and difficult decisions. Would the United States intervene militarily to defend Taiwan? Successive U.S. presidents have avoided a direct commitment, but President Biden has made statements suggesting a stronger willingness to come to Taiwan's aid. If the U.S. enters the conflict, it would likely begin with air and naval support, including aircraft carriers, submarines, and fighter jets. American bases in Japan, Guam, and potentially South Korea would be activated, making them likely targets for Chinese retaliation. A full-blown U.S.-China war would be unprecedented in scale and danger. Both nations are nuclear powers, and while neither side would seek a nuclear exchange, the risk of escalation would hang ominously over every decision. Regional allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines would be drawn into the conflict, willingly or not. NATO might be compelled to respond, not necessarily with troops, but with diplomatic and economic measures. The entire Indo-Pacific region could become a battlefield. Even without direct U.S. military intervention, the global economic shockwaves would be enormous. Taiwan's semiconductor industry would be disrupted or destroyed, crippling global supply chains. Companies dependent on microchips, from car manufacturers to tech giants, would see production grind to a halt. Stock markets would plunge, inflation would spike, and recession could sweep across major economies. Energy prices might surge if shipping lanes in the South China Sea are affected, further destabilizing the global economy. In the face of this aggression, countries around the world would have to choose sides. Some, like Russia or Iran, might support China politically or even materially. Others, including the EU, the UK, Canada, and democratic nations in Asia, would likely impose sanctions and freeze Chinese assets. A new Cold War could emerge, one that is even more economically intertwined and technologically complex than the last. Globalization itself could be reshaped or reversed as companies and governments seek to decouple from China. Domestically, the war would change both China and the United States forever. In China, a prolonged and bloody conflict could erode the legitimacy of the Communist Party, especially if the war becomes unpopular at home. Losses, economic damage, and international isolation could provoke internal unrest. In Taiwan, the destruction would be devastating, with civilian casualties, displaced populations, and years of rebuilding ahead. The very existence of Taiwan as a democracy would be at stake. In the United States, a war with China would require enormous national mobilization. Defense budgets would soar, the military draft might return, and the economy would shift toward wartime production. Political divisions could either vanish in the face of a common enemy or worsen under the strain of economic hardship and casualties. A generation that has known peace could be thrust into a brutal and uncertain era of global conflict. The long-term geopolitical consequences of a Chinese attack on Taiwan would be nothing short of world-changing. If China succeeds in taking Taiwan and holds it, it would mark the first time in the 21st century that a major democracy has been absorbed by force. It would send a chilling message to smaller nations everywhere, that military might trump sovereignty and international law. It could embolden authoritarian regimes and silence voices of freedom around the world. Alternatively, if the attack fails and China suffers a humiliating defeat, the balance of power in Asia could tilt sharply in favor of the West. The Chinese Communist Party could face an existential crisis, and internal fractures might emerge. Taiwan, having survived the unthinkable, would become a symbol of resilience, while U.S. credibility as a defender of democracy would be solidified. However, such an outcome would not come without enormous cost in blood, treasure, and global disruption. While the focus often falls on the military capabilities of China and Taiwan, the potential human cost of such a war cannot be overstated. Taiwan, with its dense cities and highly developed infrastructure, would face massive civilian casualties in the event of an all-out attack. Missile strikes on populated areas, naval blockades that restrict food and medicine, and cyber attacks on hospitals and utilities could create a humanitarian crisis almost overnight. Millions of Taiwanese civilians could be displaced. Refugees would likely flee to Japan, the Philippines, or even attempt dangerous crossings to mainland China, risking perilous journeys for uncertain safety. International humanitarian organizations would rush to provide aid, but the logistics of delivering assistance to a war-torn island surrounded by Chinese military forces would be nightmarish. Global sympathy for Taiwan would be strong, but real-time help would be delayed or blocked entirely. If the fighting drags on, Taiwan could face prolonged shortages of electricity, water, and critical medical supplies, leading to civilian suffering on a scale not seen in decades. The war would also likely spill over into the information space. Both sides would launch extensive propaganda campaigns to shape global opinion. China would use its state-controlled media to justify its actions, claiming historical rights and accusing Taiwan of provocation. Meanwhile, Taiwan would broadcast its resistance to the world, portraying itself as a David versus Goliath story of democratic survival. Social media would become a battlefield of misinformation, manipulated videos, and cyber warfare targeting civilian minds. Cyber warfare would play an unprecedented role. China has already demonstrated advanced cyber capabilities, and a full-scale digital assault would aim to paralyze Taiwan's defenses, disable communications, and compromise military systems. But it wouldn't stop there. American defense systems, financial markets, and public infrastructure might also be attacked. A blackout on Wall Street, hacks into airline control towers, power grid disruptions in U.S. cities. These would no longer be science fiction. They would be real threats in a 21st century war. Meanwhile, countries with economic or strategic interest in the region would face impossible decisions. Japan, just 100 miles north of Taiwan's nearest islands, would be deeply affected. It hosts numerous U.S. military bases and would likely be drawn into the conflict either by treaty obligation or Chinese aggression. A missile that accidentally or intentionally lands on Okinawa could trigger Article 5 discussions among U.S. allies. Australia would face intense pressure to support U.S. action. India, with its own border tensions with China, might use the conflict to reassert its position in Asia. And in Europe, leaders already wary from war in Ukraine would have to decide how far they're willing to go to sanction or isolate the world's second largest economy. The United Nations would be paralyzed. China holds veto power in the Security Council, blocking any resolutions condemning its actions. Global diplomacy would be stymied, and international institutions would appear impotent. Protesters would fill streets across the world, some in support of Taiwan's independence, others against escalation and potential world war. The internet would flood with calls for peace, but real action would remain elusive. In response to the chaos, the global economy would teeter on the edge of collapse. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, the world's most advanced chipmaker, could be rendered inoperable within days. Whether through missile strikes or strategic sabotage, the loss of TSMC's output would cripple global industries. Smartphones, computers, cars, medical equipment, all would suddenly become scarce and expensive. Production lines would halt, inflation would spike, and stock markets would crash. The price of oil and gas would surge due to instability in the South China Sea and potential U.S. blockades, critical shipping lanes through which 1/3 of global trade flows could be cut off. Countries reliant on Asian exports and imports would face shortages in weeks. Food security would become an issue in nations thousands of miles from the battlefield. What began as a regional conflict would now affect billions around the world in tangible, painful ways. And what of the nuclear threat? While a nuclear exchange remains highly unlikely, the sheer presence of nuclear arsenals in China and the U.S. adds a terrifying dimension to the conflict. One miscalculation, one errant missile, one hawkish general acting without orders could unleash devastation never before seen. Even if nuclear weapons aren't used, both sides may posture with nuclear-capable submarines, bombers, or land-based systems. Each escalation a new roll of the dice in a high-stakes game. Even without nukes, the environmental impact of war would be massive. Explosions across Taiwan's industrial zones would release toxins into air and water. Oil spills from naval battles, fires in chip foundries, and bombed-out power plants would poison ecosystems for decades. Rebuilding after such devastation would require billions of dollars and years of effort, assuming peace is eventually restored. But peace would be fragile. A Chinese-occupied Taiwan would never be fully pacified. Resistance movements would form underground, supported covertly by foreign nations. A new Cold War would be born not just in rhetoric, but in clandestine operations, assassinations, cyber strikes, and proxy wars across Asia. The ideological divide, democracy versus authoritarianism, would harden, leading to further global fragmentation. In this grim scenario, no one wins. The cost of war in Taiwan would be counted not only in lives lost, but in trust broken, economies wrecked, and futures altered. This is not just a geopolitical contest, it is a battle for the kind of world we want to live in. One where borders are respected, peace is valued, and dialogue triumphs over destruction. Or one where might makes right, and fear dictates policy. The road ahead is narrow. Leaders must avoid rash decisions. Military strength must be matched by diplomatic clarity. The people of Taiwan deserve not just sympathy but support, real, tangible support that deters aggression and ensures their voices are heard. The international community must prepare not just for war, but for preventing it. Because once the first shot is fired, there may be no turning back.